Yes, the pendulum has swung back to robber capitalism. See, I can remember when a billionaire was unknown, and now everyone on the Forbes 400 list is a billionaire or multi-billionaire. And we talk about individuals, people who have $100 billion. That was the size of the entirety of the federal government when John F. Kennedy was president. But now one person, it's $100 billion. Who is that? The Google guy or the Amazon guy, Bezos. These are nonsensical sums for an individual.
It's happening for a number of reasons. The one I've stressed for more than a decade is the offshoring of jobs. First, it was the offshoring of the manufacturing jobs, because if an American manufacturer moves his production offshore, his labor costs drop dramatically. And so the profits go up, and so the bonuses, the executive bonuses for management rise. The stock price rises, so the capital gains for shareholders go up. Wall Street's happy, shareholders are happy, executives are happy. And so this is what economic policy has been serving, this handful that we call them the 1%. And this is at the expense of the careers of people, the job opportunities, the state and local tax base. Many of the cities now have extreme budget problems. They don't have a Federal Reserve to print money for them. The states can't print money. And so this has been a huge blow. And then it was followed by moving offshore professional service jobs like software engineering, information technology, now research, design. These types of things tend to follow manufacturing.
I criticized globalism years ago and offshoring of jobs years ago. It sends you to where labor's cheapest, where there's no regulation, because then your profits are maximized. And those profits, of course, only go to management and owners. But the cost of getting those profits is you've destroyed the middle class, because all the jobs are offshore. And this doesn't just happen to manufacturing workers. Now, in the United States, it now happens to university graduates, because they move offshore software engineering, information technology. Now many forms of research and design are offshore. Many aspects of accounting are offshore. Legal research. So the kinds of jobs people go to the university for, and they get huge student loans, they're heavily indebted, and they come out and there's no jobs. We have reports that there are more Americans aged 24 to 34 years of age, living at home with parents than are living independently. So the job situation is so poor that the young cannot form households. They can't marry, they can't buy a house, they can't even get an apartment. If you've got more people, 24 to 34, living at home with their parents or grandparents than living independently, well, you've got a collapsing society.
I mean, the job opportunities are shrinking, and as you rightly noted, the real income, the real median family income have been declining for years. It's much less in real terms than it used to be. So this forces people into cheaper foods, processed foods, lots of fat. They can't afford to buy the organic foods. If you look at the prices of the kind of food that's good for you, you really have to be well-heeled. I mean, you try living an organic diet if you don't have a good income or a lot of savings to draw down. You can't do it. So they eat junk full of poisons and pesticides and glyphosate and everything else.
You know, the Federal Reserve published that for the majority of the American population, they could not raise $400 without selling personal assets. Now, this is America. The majority of the population cannot raise $400 cash without selling personal property, personal assets. And yet, we have people worth $100 billion.
Formerly, the Democratic Party represented the working class, the unions. The Republicans represented business. And so there was a balance. You had two parties, each was a check on the other, and therefore neither side could run away with it. You had to consider the interest of business, you had to consider the interests of the unions, the working class, and this gave us a livable country. There were various reforms, there were compromises. The incomes of the people were rising over time. There were opportunities. We were called an opportunity society. There were ladders of upward mobility. And it's the reason people wanted to come here, because they could rise. Well, what happened? When the Democrats permitted the offshoring of American manufacturing jobs, when the Bill Clinton people essentially sold out the working class to the business interests, this is where the Clintons' fortune has come from. You know, their personal fortune now is something like $150 million. And the foundation is something like $1,500,000,000. All that was their reward for selling out the working class, because once the manufacturing firms moved the jobs offshore to China and other parts of Asia, that was the end of the industrial unions, the manufacturing unions. And it was also the end of the working class financial ability to support the Democratic Party. So they are now dependent on the same sources of money as the Republicans. So the two parties are now funded by the same private interest groups. So they no longer one representing business, one representing labor. That's over. They represent business.
To have a society, it has to be countervailing powers. This power has to balance that one, or otherwise some group runs away with it all. Well, in the United States, all of these countervailing powers are being destroyed. For example, what was one of the main results of offshoring the middle class jobs, the manufacturing jobs, was to destroy the unions. So there's no longer any constraint by the unionized workforce on employers. So we're back to robber capitalism, because the unions essentially are gone. What few exist are in the public sector, and they're now beginning to starve them out. No raises, cuts. They use austerity reasons. So, and as we've already said, there's no longer a media to constrain them. Much of it comes back to the unleashing of the neoconservative ideology of American hegemony, which resulted from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because that removed the countervailing power that forced the United States to still think more broadly. It it was faced with a force it couldn't move aside. You couldn't unleash all of this self-interested greed that now characterizes the country. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, then there's no longer a countervailing power. And so, oh, well, now we rule. And it's like that old saying goes, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the United States held absolute power between the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the rise of Putin. So that was a long time for power to corrupt. And it succeeded. Of course, I'm sad about all this. It's funny in a way, but it's sad.
So I don't know. Generally, these protests, they go on a while and then they just fizzle out. People get tired, they have to go back to work, there are other pressing things on them, and so generally the governments just wait them out. I still don't understand why protesters accept beatings by the police. I don't understand why protesters go out to protest unarmed. I don't understand why they tolerate the police. The police are nothing, they're just people too. And there's no real reason that the police should be permitted to commit violence on those who pay their salaries, but those who are receiving the violence can't commit violence back. I don't think any of these protests will succeed until they kill the police and then kill the politicians who stick the police on them. So that's just my opinion. I didn't used to think that, but Chris Hedges has convinced me that the systems are so corrupt and rotten, they're not capable of responding to people, to citizens, that the agenda of the oligarchs that rule is totally opposed to the interest and welfare of the people who are suffering under the oligarchs. And so overthrow is the only possibility, and I just don't think the Western peoples have it in them any longer. I think they're too subdued, they're too brainwashed, they're too intimidated, they're too beaten down. I would be delighted to be completely wrong and to see this protest in France continue, to see it bring down the government, to see the protest actually produce a leader that will respond to the people. But I don't expect that to happen. I would be delighted. My faith in the possibility of people prevailing over the government without violence would be renewed, and I would like to see that. But I don't expect it, Jason. I think the ruling elites are ruling, and they don't intend to give up that rule, and they don't intend to sacrifice their agenda to that of the welfare of the French people or any other people. So it comes back, in the end, Karl Marx may have been right, that the only solution is violence. I'm not advocating violence.
No.
I'm simply saying that it looks like it's the only solution.
Yeah.
It doesn't, because everything else we try, it doesn't work. Elections, what good do they do? Never do any good.
Yeah.
Whoever gets elected is not as powerful as the oligarchs. And we see this with Trump. I mean, he's completely been moved off his agenda, hasn't he? He was going to normalize relations with Russia. There's no prospect of him ever doing that now. He's simply not permitted. They make that clear. This is what Russiagate is about, is to prevent him from normalizing relations. And they have succeeded. And they're now going to make him continue to betray the people who elected him so that he will lose that support. So without violence, it seems to me, in fact, our founding father, in many ways, our greatest, Thomas Jefferson, he made it clear that you had to periodically kill everybody in the government and start all over. He said something like every so often, I forget the time period he gave, but every so often, the tree of liberty has to be watered with the blood of tyrants.
This happened in a fairly short time. It wasn't a long, drawn-out thing. If you think back to after World War II, we had a country. It was a real country. We were unified. People believed in progress. There was goodwill. Where are these things?